Chapter 1. The Only Thing That Frightened Churchill. Winston Churchill was not easily frightened. He'd faced down the Luftwaffe during the Blitz, watched London burn night after night, and stood defiant when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. But there was one thing that genuinely terrified him, one threat that kept him awake at night. It wasn't the bombers. It wasn't an invasion. It was the U-boats. Years after the war, Churchill would write about those dark days. The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain. By the spring of 1941, Britain was in crisis. German submarines were sinking merchant ships by the hundreds. In September and October of 1940 alone, 63 ships totaling 352, 407 tons went to the bottom of the Atlantic. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Britain was an island nation that needed more than 1 million tons of imported material every week just to survive and fight. At the current rate of losses, they couldn't last much longer. The German U-boats hunted in groups they called wolf packs, coordinated by Admiral Karl Dönitz from his headquarters in Lorient, France. His submarines would gather around a convoy like wolves circling prey, attacking from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts, sending ship after ship to the bottom. The Atlantic had become a graveyard, and German submariners called it their happy hunting ground. British convoy escorts were doing their best, but it wasn't enough. They had depth charges and sonar, but finding a submarine in the vast darkness of the Atlantic was nearly impossible. The U-boats could see the convoys silhouetted against the sky, but the escorts couldn't see the submarines lurking beneath the surface. It was like fighting ghosts. And the British had no idea where the wolf packs would strike next. German radio traffic was encrypted using a machine called Enigma, an electromechanical device so sophisticated, so mathematically complex that the Germans considered it absolutely unbreakable. Every message sent by U-boat commanders went through this machine transformed into gibberish that even captured German sailors couldn't read without knowing that day's settings. The machine itself looked deceptively simple. A keyboard, a set of rotating wheels called rotors, a plug board with cables, and a lamp board that lit up to show the encrypted letters. But the mathematics behind it were staggering. With 3 rotors chosen from a set of 5 plugboard connections and daily changing settings, there were 159 quintillion possible combinations. That's 159 followed by 18 zeros. Breaking it by trial and error would take longer than the age of the universe. But Britain's codebreakers at Bletchley Park, led by a brilliant mathematician named Alan Turing, had been working on the problem since before the war started. They'd gotten help from Polish cryptologists who'd been breaking earlier versions of Enigma since the 1930s. In 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland, the Poles had shared everything they knew with the British at a secret meeting in Warsaw. It was one of the most important intelligence handoffs in history. Turing had designed a machine called the bombe to help crack Enigma. It was electromechanical, filled with rotating drums that simulated multiple Enigma machines, working simultaneously, checking thousands of possible settings to find the right one. The first bombe, named Victory, had arrived at Bletchley Park on March 14, 1940. A second improved version called Agnus Dei came in August. By mid-1940, they were reading some German Air Force traffic. But the naval Enigma was different, more complex, with additional security measures that made it nearly impossible to break. The codebreakers needed something more. They needed the actual settings. The codebooks, the daily keys that German operators used to set up their machines. Without those, they were working blind, trying to guess patterns in an ocean of possibilities. Chapter 2. Operation Primrose. On May 9, 1941, convoy OB-318 was crossing the Atlantic, 38 merchant ships crawling westward from Liverpool toward North America at 8 knots, the speed of the slowest vessel. They were escorted by the 3rd Escort Group, 8 warships led by the destroyer HMS Bulldog under Commander Joe Baker Creswell. For 3 days, German U-boats had been stalking them. On the 7th and 8th of May, submarines attacked, picking off ships from the edges of the convoy. On the 9th, U-110, under the command of Kapitän Leutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, moved in for another attack. Lemp was an experienced commander, one of the aces of the U-boat service. He'd sunk 2 ships already that day, bringing his career total to 17 vessels. But Lemp made a mistake. He left his periscope up too long, probably trying to confirm his kills. The corvette HMS Obritia spotted it and immediately turned toward the submarine, calling for help. Obritia's sonar operator got a solid contact, and the corvette dropped a pattern of depth charges. Underwater explosions hammered U-110, damaging her electrical systems and flooding several compartments. U-110 dove deep trying to escape, but HMS Bulldog and HMS Broadway were racing to join the attack. More depth charges rained down. Inside the submarine, men were thrown off their feet. Lights shattered. The hull groaned under the pressure. Lemp realized he had no choice. If he stayed down, the submarine would either be crushed by depth charges or run out of air. He gave the order to surface. U-110 broke through the waves like a wounded whale seawater, streaming from her conning tower. HMS Broadway immediately charged forward, intending to ram and sink her. Commander Baker Creswell on Bulldog watched this unfold and suddenly realized something extraordinary. The U-boat crew was abandoning ship. They were pouring out of the conning tower, jumping into the cold Atlantic water. But the submarine wasn't sinking. She was wallowing in the waves, damaged but afloat. Baker Creswell made a split-second decision that would change the course of the war. He radioed Broadway. "Don't ram. We're going to board her." The destroyer pulled alongside the U-boat, while Bulldog's crew opened fire on the water around the German sailors, not to kill them, but to drive them away from their submarine, to prevent them from swimming back and destroying the equipment inside. Lemp saw what was happening. He realized the British were going to capture U-110 with all her secrets intact. He tried to swim back to the submarine to open the scuttling valves to send her to the bottom before the British could board her. He disappeared beneath the waves and never resurfaced. Sub-Lieutenant David Balme was 20 years old. He'd been in the Royal Navy for just a few years. Now his captain was ordering him to take a whaler row across to that submarine and board her. "Get whatever you can out of her," Baker Creswell said. "Documents, books, charts, wireless settings, anything like that." Balme and his boarding party climbed down into the whaler and rowed across the gap to U-110. The submarine was rolling in the Atlantic swells, her deck slippery and treacherous. Balme was the first man aboard, climbing up the conning tower alone, drawing his pistol with a shaking hand. He later recalled it was terrifying. There were 3 sets of ladders down to the control room. If any German sailor was waiting in ambush below, Balme would be completely vulnerable. A sitting duck descending into the darkness with both hands occupied. He holstered his pistol and climbed down into the unknown. Chapter 3. The Prize. The interior of U-110 was a nightmare of destruction. Water sloshed in the bilges. The lights were out, replaced by the dim glow of emergency lighting. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, battery acid, and fear. Balme's heart was pounding so hard, he thought the Germans might hear it if any were still aboard. But as he moved through the submarine checking compartments, he realized they were gone. All of them. The crew had abandoned ship so quickly they'd left everything behind. Balme called up to the conning tower for the rest of the boarding party. Men came down carrying torches, and they began systematically looting the submarine of anything that might be valuable. In the radio room, they found something that looked important. A wooden box containing a strange machine with a keyboard and rotating wheels. Telegraphist William Stewart Pollock, a radio operator on loan to Bulldog, grabbed it. The machine looked unusual, out of place. There were also books, charts, papers, all carefully stored in their proper places. The boarding party made multiple trips between U-110 and HMS Bulldog, passing up armfuls of documents, bags of equipment, anything portable. They found Bigram tables, which showed how messages were encoded before going through the main cipher. They found current Enigma keys, the daily settings that German operators used. They found the Kurzsignale codebook, which contained short signal codes. It was an intelligence windfall beyond anyone's dreams. Baker Cresswell ordered U-110 taken in tow. If they could get her back to Britain intact, the intelligence value would be incalculable. For hours, Bulldog slowly pulled the damaged submarine through the Atlantic, while the boarding party continued stripping her of everything valuable. But U-110 was taking on water. Her seacocks had been opened just not fast enough before the crew abandoned ship. She was settling lower in the water, her bow starting to dip. The next morning, the inevitable happened. The tow line went slack. U-110's bow dipped under the waves, her stern rose into the air, and she slid beneath the surface, taking her secrets to the bottom. But the British didn't care. They already had everything that mattered. The captured material was taken to Scapa Flow in Scotland, then rushed to London. When the intelligence officers saw what had been captured, they could barely contain their excitement. What? This and this. We've waited a long time for one of these. The Enigma. Machine, the codebooks, the current settings valid through the end of June. It was everything Bletchley Park needed. Admiral Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, immediately grasped the significance. He sent a coded message to Baker Cresswell. "Hearty congratulations. The petals of your flower are of rare beauty." Operation Primrose, as it would later be codenamed, had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. King George VI would later tell David Balme that the capture of U-110 was the most important single event in the whole war at sea. Chapter 4. The Codebreakers. At Bletchley Park, the captured material from U-110 caused a revolution. Before the capture, Turing and his team had been struggling with naval Enigma, making slow progress through painstaking statistical analysis using a technique Turing had developed called banburismus. The captured codebooks suddenly gave them 6 weeks of unfettered access to German naval communications. More importantly, they learned patterns, standard phrases, the usual content of messages. This knowledge would help them break future keys even after the captured settings expired. The bomb machines went into high gear, By late 1941, there were 16 bombs operating at various locations, 6 in Hut 11 at Bletchley Park itself, and 5 each at outstations in Adstock and Wavendon. The machines ran 24 hours a day, tended by WRNS personnel, the Women's Royal Naval Service, nicknamed Wrens, who operated the complex equipment-changing rotor settings, monitoring for stops that might indicate the correct configuration had been found. The bombs were extraordinary machines for their time. Each was about 6.5 feet tall, 6.5 feet long, and 3 feet wide, filled with rotating drums that simulated Enigma rotors. The drums clicked and whirred as they spun through combinations, and when the machine found a possible solution, it stopped with a loud clunk. The operators would then test the solution manually, checking if it produced coherent German text. From mid-1940 onward, German Air Force signals were being broken regularly. But it was the naval enigma that mattered most for the Battle of the Atlantic. With the captured material from U-110 and Turing's bomb machines, the British could finally read U-boat communications fast enough to act on them. When a U-boat reported its position when wolf packs were being formed, when attack orders were sent, the submarine tracking room at the Admiralty knew about it usually within hours. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In June 1941, the month after U-110 was captured, Allied shipping losses were around 432,000 tons. By August, losses had dropped to less than 80,000 tons. Convoys were being routed around known U-boat positions. Submarines that expected to find helpless merchants found empty ocean instead. Admiral Dönitz noticed. His U-boats were reporting fewer contacts, more wasted patrols. But he never suspected the truth. The Germans remained convinced that Enigma was unbreakable. The British were paranoid about maintaining this secrecy. The German prisoners from U-110 were taken directly to Iceland and kept isolated from other prisoners. They were never told their submarine had been captured. As far as they knew, U-110 had sunk with Captain Lieutenant Lemp still aboard, and they'd been picked up by the British after abandoning ship, a normal occurrence in the Atlantic. The crew was sworn to absolute secrecy. No word of the capture could leak. If the Germans discovered that Enigma had been compromised, they would change their entire cipher system overnight, and all the advantage would be lost. Even President Franklin Roosevelt wasn't told about the capture until January 1942, 8 months after the event. That's how secret it was. Chapter 5. The Darkness Returns. But the advantage didn't last forever. In February 1942, the German Navy introduced a 4th rotor to their Enigma machines for U-boat communications. This new system, called Triton by the Germans and Shark by the British, increased the possible combinations astronomically. The 3-rotor bombs at Bletchley Park couldn't handle it. Suddenly, naval Enigma went dark again. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just 2 months earlier, in December 1941, Germany had declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. Admiral Dönitz immediately launched Operation Drumbeat, sending U-boats to the American East Coast. The United States wasn't ready. There were no convoys, no coastal blackouts, no adequate air patrols. American cities blazed with light at night, silhouetting merchant ships perfectly for the U-boats waiting offshore. Miami refused to dim its lights until mid-summer, despite protests in the local newspapers. The slaughter was unprecedented. In January 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 100 Allied ships, most of them off the U.S. East Coast. By the end of the first half of 1942, German submarines had sunk 3 million tons of shipping in American waters. 53 U-boats destroyed 485 ships between February and August. One historian would later call it the greatest American naval defeat in history. The second happy time. The U-boat crews called it. They could hardly believe their luck. Ships sailing alone lit up against the shore with virtually no opposition. It was target practice. And this time, the British couldn't warn the Americans where the wolf packs were because they couldn't read Enigma anymore. Throughout 1942, the situation deteriorated. In March, German U-boats sank approximately 500,000 tons of Allied shipping. Dönitz had 60 to 65 operational submarines and was spreading his forces into the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. The well-trained, seasoned U-boat commanders were creating a massacre of monstrous proportions. And it got worse. In March 1942, the Germans broke British naval cipher No. 3, the code used for Anglo-American convoy communications. For over a year, the Germans could read British convoy routing messages. They knew where the convoys were going before the ships themselves did. 80% of Admiralty messages from March 1942 to June 1943 were compromised. The hunters had become the hunted, and neither the British nor Americans realized it. The months of 1942 were desperate. Over 1,300 Allied ships were sunk in the Atlantic that year. U-boats were winning. Britain's survival hung in the balance. Everything depended on breaking back into Shark the four-rotor naval Enigma. The American Navy launched a crash program to develop a high-speed bomb that could handle the four-rotor system. The project was given the same priority as the Manhattan Project. Engineers at the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, worked around the clock. Cost overruns ran into millions of $1942, but there was no choice. Break Enigma or lose the war. Chapter 6. The Turning Point. In December 1942, British codebreakers got another break. The submarine U-559 was depth-charged and forced to surface in the Mediterranean. 3 British sailors, Lieutenant Anthony Fasson Abel, Seaman Colin Grazier, and young NAFI canteen assistant Tommy Brown, boarded the sinking submarine and recovered codebooks and cipher material. Fasson and Grazier went down with U-559 when she suddenly sank, but Brown escaped with the captured documents. The 2 sailors were awarded the George Cross posthumously. Their sacrifice gave Bletchley Park what it needed to crack back into Shark. By the end of 1942, the tide was turning. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. On September 27, 1941, 14 Liberty cargo ships had been launched simultaneously on Liberty Fleet Day. That was just the beginning. By the end of the war, American shipyards would produce over 2,700 Liberty ships, an average of 3 per day at the program's peak. The first American four-rotor high-speed bomb became operational in May 1943. By September 1944, 121 of them were working. Suddenly, Enigma traffic was being broken again fast enough to be actionable. Convoys could be routed around wolf packs. U-boats could be hunted down using their own radio transmissions to pinpoint their locations. Hunter-killer groups, including escort carriers, tracked submarines using Enigma intelligence and sank them one by one. May 1943 became known as Black May among German submariners. In that single month, 43 U-boats were lost. Dönitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic. It was the first time in the war that the U-boats had been defeated in open combat. For the rest of 1943, 241 U-boats would be sunk more than all previous years of the war combined. The Battle of the Atlantic was won. Allied shipping losses in 1943 dropped to half the 1942 figures. In 1944, they halved again. The convoys got through. The supplies reached Britain. The build-up for D-Day could proceed. Without breaking Enigma, none of that would have been possible. Chapter 7. The Secret War. 3 out of every 5 German submariners would die during the war, the highest casualty rate of any service in any nation's military. Over 30,000 U-boat crew members were killed. Most of them never knew why they were losing. They went to sea trusting in Enigma, believing their communications were secure, never suspecting that the enemy was reading every message, knowing their positions, their fuel states, their orders, everything. The secrecy surrounding Bletchley Park and the Enigma break was so successful that Germany never figured it out. Even after the war ended, captured German officers couldn't believe that Enigma had been broken. It was mathematically impossible, they insisted. The Allies must have had spies in the Naval High Command traders feeding them information. The truth that mathematicians, engineers, and young WRNS operators had defeated their unbreakable cipher was too much for them to accept. The men and women who worked at Bletchley Park were sworn to absolute secrecy. They couldn't tell their families what they did. They couldn't tell their friends. Many didn't speak about their wartime service for decades. David Balme didn't receive official recognition for boarding U-110 until the 1970s, when the secrecy around Enigma finally began to relax. Even his own family didn't know the full story of what he'd done that day in May 1941. Alan Turing was awarded an OBE in 1945 for his wartime work, but the citation was deliberately vague, and his role remained classified. After the war, he continued his pioneering work in computer science building on theories he'd developed before the war and refined at Bletchley Park. He designed the ACE, the automatic computing engine, which was arguably the forerunner to the modern computer. But he was never publicly celebrated for his wartime achievements during his lifetime. The full story of Bletchley Park wouldn't be revealed until the 1990s, decades after Turing's death in 1954. Historians who've studied the impact of breaking Enigma generally agree that it shortened the war by at least 2 years. Some estimates go higher. 2 years means millions of lives saved millions more who didn't die in concentration camps, entire cities that weren't destroyed. The V-2 rocket campaign against London would have been longer and deadlier. The Holocaust would have claimed more victims. The Soviet Union would have lost more territory. Japan would have held out longer. The nuclear bombs would have been dropped on different cities, or more of them. Breaking Enigma didn't just help win the Battle of the Atlantic. It provided intelligence for virtually every major Allied operation. The sinking of the battleship Scharnhorst in December 1943 was possible because of Enigma decrypts revealing her position. The D-Day invasion succeeded in part because Enigma intelligence revealed German defensive preparations and confirmed that the deception operations were working. The Battle of El Alamein in North Africa benefited from intelligence about German supply convoys and Rommel's fuel shortages. What made it all possible was a 20-year-old sub-lieutenant who climbed down into a damaged submarine in the middle of the Atlantic and came back with a wooden box containing a strange machine with a keyboard and rotating wheels. Chapter 8. The Legacy. When David Balme died in November 2019 at the age of 98, the obituaries finally told the full story. The first man to ever board a Nazi U-boat, the officer who captured the Enigma machine that changed the course of World War II, the hero who'd been forced to keep his greatest achievement secret for 30 years. In 2000, the film U-571 told a heavily fictionalized version of the story, reimagining the capture of U-110 as an American naval victory. David Balme defended the film publicly, understanding that it wouldn't have been financially viable or reached as wide an audience without being Americanized for Hollywood. But screenwriter David Ayer later admitted he felt bad about distorting the historical record. Both his grandfathers had been officers in World War II. He said, and he'd be personally offended if somebody distorted their achievements. The real story needs no embellishment. On May 9, 1941, a young officer with both hands occupied climbing down ladders into a damaged enemy submarine vulnerable to ambush, terrified but determined captured materials that would help win the most important naval campaign of the war. He didn't do it alone. The entire crew of HMS Bulldog played a role. The decision to board rather than sink the submarine was made by Commander Baker Creswell. The Enigma machine was actually grabbed by telegraphist Pollock. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park did the intellectual heavy lifting. The WRNS operators kept the bombs running day and night. Thousands of people contributed to this victory. But it started with that capture on May 9, 1941. When the Enigma machine and codebooks from U-110 reached Bletchley Park, when Alan Turing and his team began reading U-boat communications, when convoy routing could be changed to avoid wolf packs, when Allied shipping losses dropped from 432,000 tons to 80,000 tons in just 2 months, that's when the war turned. Winston Churchill had been right to fear the U-boat peril. For 2 years, Germany came close to starving Britain into submission. The Atlantic was a killing field, and German submarines ruled the night. Every convoy that sailed was a gamble. Every merchant sailor who went to sea knew he might not come back. The mathematics of the tonnage war were brutal: sink more ships than the Allies can build, and Britain falls. It was that simple. But mathematics also saved Britain. The mathematical genius of Alan Turing, who designed the bombe. The mathematical complexity of Enigma, which seemed unbreakable but wasn't. The mathematics of probability and statistics, which Turing used in Banburismus to narrow down possible settings. And finally, the simple arithmetic of shipping losses from over 400,000 tons per month to less than 80,000 from certain defeat to possible victory. Today, 3 working bombe machines exist. One at Bletchley Park, rebuilt by a team of volunteers over a decade, using the original blueprints. One at the National Museum of Computing, and one in Poland, honoring the country where the fight against Enigma began. They stand as monuments to what can be achieved when brilliant minds focus on an impossible problem and refuse to give up. The original Enigma machine captured from U-110 is now in the collection at Bletchley Park, a small wooden box that changed the world. Visitors can see it, this mechanical marvel that the Germans thought was unbreakable, defeated by a combination of mathematical genius, engineering skill, incredible bravery, and the simple luck of a periscope left up too long on a spring morning in the Atlantic. When Sub-Lieutenant David Balme climbed down into U-110 that day, he had no idea what he was capturing. He was just following orders, terrified, expecting to be shot at any moment. But in that wooden box, he found in those codebooks and cipher materials lay the key to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. And when the codebreakers at Bletchley Park saw what he'd brought them, when they realized they could finally read U-boat communications, they understood something profound. The war could be won. Not easily, not quickly, but it could be won. And that changed everything.